The hushed air of the El Paso church in 1898 vibrated with a quiet expectation. Pastor Elias Vance stood before his congregation, his hands resting on the worn pulpit, ready to deliver his Sunday sermon. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight slicing through the tall windows, illuminating faces that ranged from weathered pioneers to earnest young families. He took a deep breath, about to speak, when the heavy oak doors at the back of the church burst open with a soft thud. Every head turned. Martha, a woman Elias had come to know in his short time in El Paso, stood framed in the doorway, her usually pale face now stark white. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and her eyes, wide with a terror Elias had never seen, darted around the room before locking onto him. A whisper, sharp and desperate, cut through the sacred silence. "He knows. He's coming for me." The words hung in the air, a raw, primal fear that shattered the morning's peace. Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He knew Martha was a lonely soul, often quiet, but never before had he seen her so utterly undone. She stumbled forward a few steps, her gaze still fixed on him, a silent plea in her eyes. "Who, Martha? Who knows?" Elias asked, his voice calm despite the sudden jolt of alarm. She pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, her eyes darting back to the doors as if expecting someone to follow. "Mr. Silas Thorne," she choked out, the name a venomous hiss. "His messenger, just now. He said he knows about my past. He's coming to finish it." Her confession was laced with the kind of dread that spoke of a secret long buried, now unearthed and ready to consume her. A murmur rippled through the congregation. Silas Thorne was a powerful name in El Paso, a man whose influence stretched far and wide. Elias felt a prickle of unease. He had always known Thorne was formidable, but to inspire such stark terror in Martha, that was something else entirely. Elias, usually known for his gentle demeanor and thoughtful sermons, felt a quick surge of something unfamiliar, a protective anger. He looked at the faces in the congregation, a mix of curiosity, concern, and a few whispers of judgment already beginning to form. This was not the time for a sermon. He raised a hand, his voice clear and firm, cutting through the rising hum of voices. "Friends, please, there has been an urgent matter. I ask for your understanding. The service will be postponed." His gaze swept over them, a silent command for order. "Please return home. We will gather again next week." His composure was calculated, a shield against the brewing chaos. He watched as people slowly, reluctantly gathered their things. The usual chatter was replaced by hushed conversations and curious glances back at Martha, who now stood frozen, clutching her shawl. Elias made sure each congregant left, his eyes meeting theirs, reassuring them with a quiet strength that hinted at a deeper resolve. This was not just an interruption, it was a challenge, and he felt an unexpected plan beginning to form in his mind. As the last congregant shuffled out, the heavy oak doors closing with a soft click, Elias turned back to Martha. The church was now dim, shadows stretching long across the pews. He walked towards her, his footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze unwavering, no longer just a gentle pastor, but a man with a purpose. "He chose the wrong soul to torment," Elias stated, his voice low but firm, a quiet pronouncement that carried the weight of impending justice. The air grew thick with unspoken questions. What was Thorne's threat? What secret did Martha carry? And what would this unassuming pastor do next? The church doors clicked shut completely, plunging them into deeper shadow. The fate of Martha and the pastor's next move hung suspended in the quiet, dusty air. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Pastor Elias Vance had arrived in El Paso in the spring of 1898, a season of both harsh winds and blooming desert flowers. He remembered the feeling of the dust in his teeth, the vast, empty sky, and the distant, jagged mountains that seemed to hold the horizon in place. El Paso was a town of stark contrasts. It was a place where sun-baked adobe buildings sat next to newly erected brick structures, where the scent of mesquite smoke mingled with the faint smell of coal and industry. It was a frontier town still, raw and untamed in many ways, but growing fast. Mexicans and Americans lived side by side, their cultures weaving together in the daily rhythm of the streets. He had seen vaqueros riding past ladies in fine hats, heard Spanish and English spoken in the same breath at the market. It was a vibrant, sometimes chaotic place, a far cry from the quiet New England towns he had served before. Life in El Paso was hard, but people were resilient. Days were long, filled with work under the relentless sun. Evenings brought a different kind of energy, with music from cantinas and the steady hum of a community trying to build something lasting. The church, however, stood as a central pillar, a place not just for spiritual guidance, but for social order and connection. It was where people gathered for comfort, for news, and for a sense of belonging in a world that could often feel isolating. Social expectations were strict, especially for women, and gossip could travel faster than any horse across the desert. Reputation was everything, and a misstep could lead to swift judgment. Elias himself was a man of quiet conviction. He had come to El Paso seeking a fresh start, a place where his ministry could truly take root. His previous congregations had been small, comfortable, and he admitted to himself a little too easy. He carried a certain loneliness, a quiet yearning to make a real, tangible difference in people's lives. He wasn't seeking fame or power, but a deep sense of purpose. El Paso, with its challenges and its raw potential, felt like both a daunting test and a profound opportunity for a man of faith. He wanted to be more than just a pastor. He wanted to be a shepherd for a flock that truly needed guidance. It was in this setting that he first noticed Martha. She was a quiet fixture in his new congregation, always seated towards the back, her dark hair pulled back neatly, her eyes often downcast. She never spoke much, never lingered after services, but she was always there, a steady, unassuming presence. Elias, with his keen pastoral eye, sensed a quiet strength in her, a resilience that spoke of unspoken burdens. Their interactions were brief at first, a polite nod, a murmured greeting, but he recognized a kindred spirit in her quiet observation, a shared understanding of the world that went beyond words. She seemed to see things just as he did beneath the surface of daily life. And then there was Mr. Silas Thorne. Thorne was a name whispered with a mixture of respect and fear throughout El Paso. He was a man of significant wealth, with fingers in every important pie in town, land, mining, even the fledgling railroad. He was a figure of immense influence, his opinions swaying decisions, his presence commanding attention. He wasn't a regular churchgoer, but he would appear occasionally, perhaps for a special event or a public display of civic piety. He would sit in a prominent pew, his gaze sweeping over the congregation, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk on his lips. Elias had observed him too, sensing the pervasive power that Thorne held, a power that seemed to extend beyond mere money. He was a force in El Paso, a man whose shadow stretched long over the dusty streets and the lives of its people. The fragile bond between Elias and Martha, born of quiet observation and shared solitude, was already forming against this backdrop. It was a connection built on unspoken understanding, a small flicker of warmth in a town where the line between community and judgment was often blurred, and beneath it all, the unspoken authority of Silas Thorne loomed, a subtle tension that already promised to shatter the quiet peace. Martha's quiet demeanor wasn't just a part of her personality, it was a shield, carefully constructed over years of subtle pressure and veiled threats. Even before Elias arrived, her life in El Paso had been chipped away by the relentless, often invisible influence of Silas Thorne. He had a way of leaving people feeling indebted, of making promises that always seemed to benefit him more than anyone else. She remembered the early days when Thorne had offered to help her family with a legal matter, a small dispute over property lines. It seemed like a kindness then, a powerful man extending a hand. But the assistance came with strings, unspoken expectations that slowly tightened around her life. Her family lost a small piece of land, and Thorne gained a new quiet control over their affairs, making them feel beholden. There were other instances, small humiliations that added up, a community project where Thorne's generosity meant Martha's contributions were quietly sidelined, her ideas ignored. A social gathering where Thorne made a seemingly innocent comment about her deceased father's past business dealings, a comment that, to those who knew, cast a shadow of doubt on her family's reputation. These weren't outright attacks, but a slow, steady erosion of her standing, making her feel small and insignificant. It was a clever game Thorne played, always appearing benevolent, yet always ensuring he came out on top, leaving others feeling subtly diminished. El Paso in 1898 was a town built on strict social rules. For a woman like Martha, without a husband or a strong male relative to protect her interests, there was little room for error. A woman's reputation was her most valuable possession, easily shattered by gossip or insinuation. Thorne understood this perfectly. He didn't need to physically threaten her, he just needed to make sure that the subtle currents of the town's social life worked against her. She heard whispers, not about anything specific, but a general air of suspicion that seemed to follow her. She felt eyes on her, not always hostile, but always judging, always questioning. Her fear wasn't a sudden onset. It was a slow-burning ember, stoked by years of Thorne's calculated actions. She found herself avoiding social gatherings not because she disliked people, but because the effort of navigating the unspoken rules of parrying the subtle barbs was exhausting. Her eyes, often downcast, would dart around when she was in public, scanning for Thorne, for his associates, for any sign that she was being watched. Her anxiety was a constant companion, a heavy blanket that muffled her joy and her spirit. She knew Thorne could, with a few well-placed words, turn the entire town against her. He had done it before, to others, and she knew she was next. Her secret, whatever it was a weapon in his hand, ready to be used. The fear she carried was not just of physical harm, but of something far worse in that era. Social ruin, to be ostracized, to lose her reputation, to be left without a place in the community. That was the true terror Thorne wielded. The threat she had whispered to Elias, "He knows, he's coming for me," wasn't just about a single moment. It was the culmination of years of psychological warfare, of living under the thumb of a man who delighted in control. It was the breaking point, the moment she realized Thorne was finally ready to unleash the full force of his power, to publicly expose whatever secret he held over her, and thereby destroy her life in El Paso completely. Her fear was not vague, it was specific, rooted in the very real possibility of public annihilation and utter disgrace. The air in El Paso grew thick with unspoken tension, a palpable shift that settled over the dusty streets and bustling markets. Elias felt it, and Martha lived it every waking moment. Thorne's influence, once a subtle undercurrent, began to surface more overtly, like dark weeds pushing through cracks in the pavement. His agents, identifiable by their crisp suits and watchful eyes, appeared more frequently around Martha's modest home, their presence a constant, unsettling reminder of the unseen strings Thorne pulled. They never spoke to her directly, but their lingering gazes and slow, deliberate movements were threat enough. Martha would sometimes catch their reflection in a shop window, or see them loitering a block away, pretending to adjust a hat or light a cigar. It was a silent siege, designed to wear her down. Whispers, too, began to circulate, insidious and persistent. They started small, in the general store, at the well, among the women gathering for afternoon tea. Not outright accusations, but vague remarks about Martha's past, her solitary nature, and why a woman of her age remained unmarried. These rumors, subtle yet effective, were expertly woven into the town's social fabric by Thorne's network. They were crafted to cast doubt, to erode trust, and to isolate her further. Martha, once just a quiet, respectable woman, was slowly being recast in the public eye as an enigma, perhaps even someone with something to hide. Her quiet demeanor, once seen as modest, was now interpreted as secretive. Her solitude, once a personal choice, became a target for gossip, proof of her supposed strangeness. This increased scrutiny bore down on Martha. Neighbors who once offered a polite nod now averted their eyes or offered curt greetings. Children, sensing the shift in adult attitudes, would sometimes point or whisper as she passed. She felt like an outsider in her own community, the very place she had called home for so long. It was a slow, painful peeling away of her sense of belonging. Elias, despite his growing resolve, was not immune to this pressure. He noticed the subtle changes in how some parishioners interacted with him after sermons, the slightly longer pauses before they shook his hand, the veiled questions about Martha's situation. A few prominent members of the church, men with significant influence and connections, gently suggested that his close association with Martha might inadvertently reflect poorly on the church's reputation. They didn't explicitly ask him to distance himself, but the implication hung heavy in the air. Elias understood the social game Thorne was playing. He was trying to isolate both Martha and anyone who dared to stand with her. Thorne himself, while maintaining his public facade of charming respectability, became more aggressive in his private dealings with Martha. The veiled threats became less veiled. Messages, delivered through his intermediaries, were now direct and chilling. They spoke of specific details from her past, things only she and a few others knew, reminding her of his far-reaching knowledge and his ability to expose her secrets. He emphasized the consequences of defiance, painting vivid pictures of her public disgrace and ruin. Each message was a calculated jab, designed to break her spirit and force her into submission. He wanted her to understand that he held her life, her reputation, and her future completely in his hands. Elias felt the weight of it all. He grappled with his pastoral duty, his commitment to protect the vulnerable, and the very real dangers posed by a man as powerful and ruthless as Thorne. He wrestled with the fear of alienating his congregation, of tarnishing the church's standing, and of the potential personal cost of challenging Thorne directly. This was not just a spiritual battle, it was a worldly one with very real consequences. He knew that if he failed, Martha would be utterly destroyed, and his own ministry in El Paso might never recover. The pressure was immense, a suffocating burden that pressed down on him, demanding a response, a breaking point before he could act. The suffocating pressure on Elias finally broke, but not in the way Thorne expected. Instead of breaking Elias, it sharpened his focus. He knew he couldn't fight Thorne with sermons alone. He needed something concrete, something that would dismantle Thorne's carefully constructed image from the inside. Elias began his own discreet investigation, moving cautiously, asking quiet questions in dusty corners of the town, listening to the murmurs of the less fortunate, the whispers of those Thorne had wronged but silenced. He spent hours in the church archives, poring over old land deeds and town records, cross-referencing names and dates. It was slow, painstaking work, often frustrating, but Elias was driven by a quiet fury. He wasn't just protecting Martha, he was defending the very idea of justice in El Paso. What Elias uncovered was not about Martha's past, it was far more damning. He found a pattern, a meticulously hidden web of deceit that stretched back years. Thorne wasn't just a powerful businessman, he was a master manipulator of the legal system, a land grabber who used loopholes and intimidation to acquire property for pennies on the dollar. He had exploited illiterate settlers, forged signatures on documents, and bribed minor officials. There were instances of extortion, where small business owners were strong-armed into selling their properties or faced trumped-up charges. Thorne's corruption wasn't simple greed, it was a systemic abuse of power, carefully concealed behind his respectable facade and his generous church donations. Elias found evidence of families driven from their homes, their livelihoods ruined, all to fuel Thorne's growing empire. The truth was far more sinister than anyone had imagined. At the same time, Martha, pushed to her absolute limit by Thorne's escalating threats, finally unburdened herself to Elias. The last message from Thorne had been a cruel reminder of her family's desperate situation years ago, a time when she had been forced to rely on Thorne's generosity. It was this very act of kindness that Thorne was now using against her. Martha revealed that she possessed critical evidence of Thorne's wrongdoing, something he desperately wanted to suppress. Years ago, when Thorne had offered to help her family with a legal matter, he had coerced her father into signing over a significant piece of land under false pretenses. Martha, then a young woman, had been present. She had secretly kept a copy of the original legitimate deed, along with a signed affidavit from her dying father, detailing Thorne's deception. It was a testament to her quiet defiance and resilience, a dangerous secret she had guarded for years, knowing it could ruin Thorne, but also put her in grave danger. This evidence was not just a piece of paper, it was a symbol of Thorne's deep-seated corruption and his willingness to prey on the vulnerable. Armed with this devastating knowledge about Thorne's true nature, and with Martha's trust, Elias made a profound decision. He realized that confronting Thorne directly through conventional means, a public accusation from the pulpit, or an appeal to the corrupted local authorities, would not work. Thorne held too much sway, too many people in his pocket. Elias understood that he needed to leverage the very social and religious structures Thorne exploited to turn Thorne's own weapons against him. He devised a plan that was audacious, risky, but potentially devastating to Thorne. This moment marked the complete shift in the narrative. Elias moved from a passive protector to an active strategist. The dynamic between him, Martha, and Thorn was irrevocably altered. The fear that had once paralyzed Martha, that had made her a silent victim, was now channeled into a shared resolve. She had found an ally, and with Elias, a path to reclaiming her dignity. The quiet fear was replaced by a simmering determination, a calm strength born from having nothing left to lose. Elias felt the surge of conviction, knowing he was doing what was right, not just for Martha, but for the soul of El Paso itself. The game had changed. Elias's plan was now in motion. He started subtly, using his sermons not to directly attack Thorn, but to speak about integrity, about the quiet corruption that can fester in a community, and about the importance of truth. He spoke of wolves in sheep's clothing, of those who claim piety but practice deceit. He never named Thorn, but the words hung in the air, pointed directly at the man who sat in the front pew, always conspicuously present. He also began having discreet conversations with influential townsfolk, people who had perhaps been subtly wronged by Thorn or who simply valued honesty. He would share carefully chosen anecdotes, always framed as hypothetical situations, but with enough detail that those who knew Thorn's reputation could connect the dots. Internally, Elias was a mess of conflicting emotions. Doubt gnawed at him. Was he truly serving God, or was he just feeding his own anger? He feared failure, feared the backlash from Thorn, who was a dangerous man. He wrestled with the moral implications of his actions, walking a thin line between exposing injustice and engaging in what felt like manipulation. He found himself praying more intensely than ever, seeking guidance, often feeling lost in the moral gray areas. The weight of his spiritual calling felt heavy, tested by the necessity of worldly action. He had always believed in a gentle approach, in turning the other cheek. Now, he was actively trying to dismantle a man's power, and it felt unsettling, yet undeniably necessary. The community reacted with a mix of disbelief, curiosity, and growing unease. Some influential members, initially loyal to Thorn out of fear or benefit, began to question him. Elias's subtle campaign chipped away at Thorn's carefully constructed image. Whispers started, not about Martha anymore, but about Thorn himself. People remembered small slights, unfair dealings, and now they connected them to Elias's sermons. Others, those who had been truly wronged by Thorn but were too afraid to speak, became quiet allies. They would approach Elias after services, offering small pieces of information, corroborating stories, their eyes filled with a fragile hope. A few remained fiercely loyal to Thorn, however. These were the ones who benefited directly from his schemes, or those who simply feared his power too much to question it. They started spreading rumors about Elias, calling him a meddler, a firebrand, suggesting he was meddling in affairs that were not his to judge. They whispered about Martha, trying to revive the old gossip, hoping to discredit Elias by association. The strict social codes of El Paso, where public reputation was paramount, played a crucial role in how people responded. Thorn's carefully cultivated image of a benevolent, powerful figure was his shield. Elias was slowly but surely chipping away at that shield. Thorn, sensing his carefully constructed image cracking, became increasingly desperate and reckless. He lashed out at perceived enemies, made hasty business decisions, and even publicly threatened a local newspaper editor who dared to print a veiled critique. These actions, born of desperation, only served to further expose his true nature, making him seem less like a respected leader and more like a cornered animal. Each mistake fueled the growing suspicion in the town. Martha, initially still terrified, began to experience a fragile sense of hope. Seeing Elias stand up, seeing the community slowly turn, gave her a strength she hadn't realized she possessed. The fear that had once paralyzed her was slowly replaced by a quiet sense of empowerment. Elias, though burdened by the immense pressure and internal conflict, found a new strength in his conviction. The burgeoning support from the community, the quiet nods of agreement, the shared whispers of concern reinforced his belief that he was doing the right thing. He was no longer alone in this fight. The soul of El Paso itself seemed to be stirring. Elias's carefully orchestrated plan reached its peak. The evidence Martha held, the proof of Thorn's land fraud and extortion, combined with Elias's strategic revelations from the pulpit and his quiet conversations, created an undeniable case against the powerful man. Public opinion, once swayed by Thorne's charm and money, now turned decisively against him. People started openly discussing his questionable business dealings, the way he squeezed out smaller landowners, and how he used his influence to silence opposition. The whispers became shouts, then public accusations. Thorne's power crumbled quickly. He was exposed not just as a corrupt businessman, but as a man who had preyed on the vulnerable, who had built his empire on the suffering of others. His public reputation was completely destroyed. His supposed friends and allies, seeing the tide turn, abandoned him. Business partners pulled out, banks called in loans, and the legal challenges began. For a man like Thorne, whose entire identity was tied to his standing and wealth in El Paso, this was a fate worse than any prison. He lost his properties, his businesses, and eventually his mansion. He became a ghost in the very town he once dominated, a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones. He was, to all intents and purposes, banished from El Paso's influential circles, his power and privilege gone. Martha, now free from the suffocating fear that had defined her life for so long, began to rebuild. She was no longer the lonely, terrified woman who had walked into Elias's church that day. The strength she had shown in holding on to the evidence, in finally speaking her truth, had transformed her. She found a renewed sense of community. The very people who had once whispered about her now offered kindness and respect. She started volunteering at the church, helping Elias with his outreach programs, her quiet resilience inspiring others. She became an advocate in her own way, a living testament to what courage could achieve, a symbol of hope for those who felt powerless. She learned to laugh again, to walk with her head held high, no longer scanning over her shoulder for shadows. Elias emerged as a respected and beloved figure in El Paso. His faith and courage had not only saved Martha, but had also helped to cleanse the town of a pervasive evil. His church became more than just a place of worship. It became a true sanctuary for all, a place where justice and compassion truly prevailed. People from all walks of life came to him, seeking guidance, comfort, and sometimes simply a listening ear. He had shown them that true leadership wasn't about power or wealth, but about standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult and dangerous. He had not compromised his beliefs, but had found a way to live them out in a world that often seemed to defy them. The ending was not a fairy tale, but a realistic portrayal of justice in the frontier West. Thorne faced the consequences of his actions, not necessarily in a courtroom, but in the complete destruction of his social and financial standing, which, in that era, was often more devastating. Martha found peace, not through a sudden miracle, but through her own strength and the unwavering support of a good man and a community that finally saw the truth. The story of Pastor Elias Vance and Martha became a quiet legend in El Paso. It underscored the power of faith, courage, and community in confronting injustice. It showed how even the most unassuming individuals, a quiet pastor and a lonely woman, could bring about profound change. True strength, Elias had learned, lay not in worldly power or influence, but in moral conviction, unwavering empathy, and the courage to stand up for those who could not stand for themselves. The spirit of El Paso, once shadowed by fear and corruption, now breathed a little freer, a little purer, thanks to their quiet defiance.